be here. And first of all, good evening and welcome to all of you, and thank you for being with us. On behalf of the Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, I want to tell you how much we're excited about this new online series, and couldn't have better company than Mr. Rotenberg. Maybe the rainy weather that's we're seeing now in Toronto is working in our favor because we have a great turnout, which is very gratifying, especially knowing that it's March break. Some people are away. And also, of course, we're up against a Leaf game, which is just about to begin. So I thank all of you for making the time to be with us. As Elise just mentioned, for this inaugural edition of Book Talk, we are really honored to have with us Robert Rotenberg, the esteemed Toronto-based crime novelist, who also happens to be a good, long-standing friend of mine. While he actually goes by Robert on his books, don't be surprised that I address him as Bobby, as does everyone else who knows him personally. And two Roberts on one program is maybe too much anyhow. In a few minutes, we're going to begin our discussion. And one of the things that Bobby is going to be starting to talk about is how the Holocaust has figured in some way in all of his 7 crime novels, especially the latest, which was just recently published. But before we get into any of that, I'd like to first play a short video, which really will shed some light on Bobby's new book.
Can't hear it.
Seem to be having some audio issues here. I'm sorry, there actually is sound, even though it doesn't seem like there is. Elise, is there anything you can do to get that sound working?
You can't hear the sound?
No.
No? Okay, let me try again. I'll try again.
In the year 2000, when my now 24-year-old daughter was a baby, we went to Italy for a few weeks. One day we ended up in Gubbio, a perfectly preserved, rather remote medieval hill town in Umbria. That afternoon, we watched the 500-year-old crossbow contest held in one of the most magnificent squares in all of Europe, complete with flag wavers, trumpeters, and costume competitors. We loved it. At that point, I had not even started writing my novels, but I knew in my heart that one day I had to include this spectacle in a book. For years, in the books, Daniel kept putting off dealing with his brother Michael's murder. Why? Well, I'm to blame. How could Daniel figure out what happened to his brother until I did? I'll confess, I knew it was a powerful story, but I had no idea what the answer was. That's why it took me 3 years to write my new novel. This is it, What We Buried. Along the way, I discovered the tragic key to the mystery. In June 1944, when Germany occupied Italy, and one afternoon, Italian partisans killed a Nazi officer and injured another. As revenge, Hitler demanded the murder of 40 innocent civilians. This horror became the spine of the novel. As I was completing the manuscript, I knew I had to go back to Gubbio. Here are some of the photos I took of the Gubbio Crossbow Museum, the current crossbow champion, the compelling shrine to the 40 martyrs, and most remarkable of all, a 94-year-old priest who, at horrible risk to himself, because the Nazis didn't just murder priests who assisted Jews, they tortured them to death, hid a Jewish family from Florence in his monastery. There's more to this novel. What about the suspicious car accident that killed Kennicott's parents 2 years before his brother's murder. At last, Detective Ari Green heads back up north to investigate. And there's a third story. I'm not the child of Holocaust survivors, but as readers of my novels will know, my main character, Ari Green, is. So are many of my closest friends. For years, I've talked to their survivor parents and collected their stories. To research this novel, I read every book I could get my hands on about Italy during and after the war. Like many Holocaust survivors, Ari's father, Yitzhak, a favorite of many of my readers, has never told anyone about what he did after the war. At last, in this novel, he sits down with his beloved granddaughter, the young journalist Allison Green, and she videotapes his story. Pulling these three disparate stories together, bringing back characters from earlier books, and creating a host of new ones made this the most difficult book to write of any of my novels, and the most rewarding. I'm glad I took up the challenge. I hope you enjoy my new book, What We Buried.
Okay, thanks, Elise, for playing the video, and our thanks to Davin Bujowski for preparing that video. Just ahead of the Q&A with Bobby, I'm going to read a bio for those of you who perhaps are not as familiar with his career and his interesting life so far. But before I do, I just want to give a reminder, as Elise mentioned, we encourage questions from all of you in the audience, and you can submit those in the chat box. And throughout the evening, we are going to share some of your questions with Bobby. At the same time, courtesy of Bobby's publisher, Simon & Schuster Canada, we're going to be giving away 5 signed copies during the evening. And to win a copy, you simply need to be the first person to correctly answer one of the 5 questions that we'll be posing to you during the interview, and then writing your answer in the chat box. Now to Bobby's bio, which is short and has, given its brevity, it really doesn't do full justice to his career, but it'll at least give you some sense. So you'll allow me to read it for you. Toronto figures prominently in the life of Robert Rotenberg. It's not only his place of birth, but also where he has long practiced criminal law. It's also the setting for his series of best-selling murder mysteries, and it's also where he still plays hockey. Since his first book, Old City Hall, appeared in 2009, to much acclaim, he has written 6 more, including the just published What We Buried. In all his books, the main protagonist is homicide detective Ari Green, the son of a Holocaust survivor. Before becoming a criminal defense lawyer, Bobby was the editor and co-publisher of a Toronto magazine for several years, after working in France as the managing editor of a Paris city magazine for a year. It's now my great pleasure to call onto the screen Bobby Rotenberg.
Good evening, Robert. That was nice to hear. You forgot to mention that when I was in Paris, I was working for the magazine that you founded and ran for many, many, many successful years. It's pretty special to be able to do this with you.
Thank you. It's great to have you with us here this evening. And before I get to the first question, Bobby, I do want to extend my warmest congratulations, because although your latest book was just published 2 weeks ago, as you know, it's already on several of the bestseller lists in Canada and has received many, many positive reviews. So mazel tov on that.
Thanks.
First question. For people not familiar with your books, I'm sure there are some out there, can you explain briefly how the Holocaust has always had a certain presence in your books, even if sometimes it's indirect?
Well, when I came up with the idea for the books, and I'll never know where he came from, I came up with this idea that the only Jewish homicide, only homicide detective on the Toronto Police Force was the only Jewish one was this fellow, Ari Green. Now, I'm not the child of Holocaust survivors, but I grew up, I went to Bathurst Heights, which many of you will know. I would say the majority of my friends, my partner, Alvin Chudlowski, many of my best friends are. And I grew up kind of in their homes, talking to their parents. And somehow it just seemed so compelling to write a story about this detective. And I found through all the books, the relationship between he and his father, and in the later books between his granddaughter and the grandfather, it really strikes a chord with people, and not just Jewish people. I get emails from people all around the world saying the relationship between Ari and his father really speaks to me. It's really something special. So I didn't want to write simplistic or easy books. And the other thing you'll find interesting, Robert, is a lot of people who are Holocaust survivors, my friends or contemporaries, say to me, they couldn't have written it. It was too close to them. And I think being just one step away really made me like more an observer, which really is your job as a writer. So where he came from, I don't know, but I just know in the first book, there he was cleaning the snow off his father's doorstep that's just who he was. That's who he is.
Since the first book, has it made you want to learn more about the Holocaust?
You know, you once said to me, you watch it with the Holocaust because it's an endless well. And not just the Holocaust, but everything that happened in World War II. And in this book in particular, I'm actually fascinated by what happened after the war, about those 3 or 4 years where the Jews, about 250,000 Jews were stuck in Europe. They went home to Poland, Lithuania, and to the horrors, ended up back in Italy or Germany, in the DP camps, which had the highest birth rate in the world. I find that whole era really fascinating. And I've been what's very interesting is responses from people who are not Jewish. And a lot of them, I think we in the Jewish community tend to think everyone knows everything about it, about the Holocaust and what happened. And quite shockingly, even very bright, educated people really have huge gaps in their knowledge. And they really appreciate hearing from me about it. And that's one of the joys of writing fiction, is you can tell a story without lecturing people, just through the characters.
Have you read other works of fiction in which the Holocaust figures prominently? And if so, did that have any impact on you or any influence on you?
Well, you know, it's interesting when we were talking about this the other day, and by the way, I don't know what the questions are going to be, even though we're best friends, just so the crowd knows we haven't prepared the questions. But this is the first book that I wrote. Much of it is based on real historical facts. The slaughter, the massacre in Gubbio is a real fact. A number of things in the book are real. And it occurred to me, I remember when I was about 14 years old, Camp White Pine, reading Exodus. And if you think about it, in many ways, that's what he did in Exodus. He took fictional characters and he put them in a real setting. I would say mostly what I read were documentary type books, historic books. I can't think of many fictional books that were really based around about like the lives of survivors.
As I mentioned earlier, thanks to Simon Schuster, we are giving away 5 signed copies of What We Buried. And the first person to answer each question will get a copy. And the way you can win is if you know the answer, or you think you know the answer, the correct answer, please enter it into our chat box. So here's the first question. While researching his latest book, Bobby learned that of all the countries in Western Europe in World War II, in which one did the Nazis deport the highest percentage of the Jewish population to concentration camps? So if you think you know the answer and you want to win a copy of the book, please put it in the chat box. And we'll be reading out, at the end of the program, we'll read out the correct answers to all the questions. So back to you now, Bobby. As a writer,
Yeah.
what is the biggest challenge of incorporating real life historical events in a fictional story?
That's a very good question. I think the biggest challenge is to make it as real as possible. In the other books, which are set in Toronto, every place that I talk about, every restaurant, every cafe, every street, I go to, I spend a lot of time at. Of course, when you're talking about something that happened a long time ago, you can't actually go back in time. But for example, for this book, as I said in that video, we were there 24 years ago, and I went back to Gubbio, and as you can see in the video. And even my editor said, well, do you really need to go back? And I said, yes. I mean, even if it's only 5 or 6 or 10 paragraphs in the book that are different, but I just needed to walk the streets, to touch the stones, to know when Kennicott turns right, getting out of the square, that's the right thing to do. And I think readers somehow intuitively know when you're faking it. I have to say that YouTube is extraordinary because it's incredible how much that you can find on YouTube. Just as a simple example, without giving away too much in the book, when Ari's father describes going back to the town that he grew up in Poland, which is where my family comes from, Ivan's, he talks about, he meets this one friend who'd been loyal to him, whose daughter had been kidnapped by the Nazis. And what I found is that the Nazis actually kidnapped about 60,000 young people. And then you start seeing videos of people who say, well, my sister was made into a German and she'll never talk to me again. It's this unbelievable story. When you see the real people who are talking about that and the pain in their faces and their voices, that's what you can try to put into the novel.
Before I get to the next question, I just want to mention I've been looking at the chat box. Not that I'm not paying attention to your answer, but I just gave a glance. Interestingly, many people have submitted answers to that question. I noticed that most of them are not correct. And that maybe points to what you were saying earlier about sometimes the lack of knowledge in connection with the Holocaust. As I said before, we'll give you the correct answer later. But we definitely, there's a winner. There is a winner, but anyhow, and it's the first person with the correct answer, because there is now more than one person who answered correctly, but I'm sorry that we have to favor the one who gave it first.
As Rodney Dangerfield would say, what a crowd, what a crowd.
Next question, you mentioned that in the video, you mentioned actually that this was the hardest of all the 7 books for you to write. And I'd like to know why this, of all the 7, was the hardest.
Well, there's a few reasons. The first is that in the very first novel, Old City Hall, I set up this, what writers call backstory, that the second main character's name is Daniel Kennicott. 10 years before, 12 years before, his parents were killed, as you saw, in this kind of mysterious car accident driving up to their cottage. And 2 years later, his brother phones him and says, I've discovered something. I'm going to this town, Gubbio in Italy. He says, why are you going? He says, well, I'll tell you in person. And this is not really to give anything away. Before he can meet his brother is killed in broad daylight out in Yorkville. And so for years and years, I've been getting emails from my readers saying, well, when are we going to find out who killed Daniel's parents? And some of them are very, very funny. The problem, Robert, was I had no idea. I'd set up this great concept, but I had to figure out why. And some of the ideas I came up with were really simplistic and cliched. So I kept writing and writing. That's the first reason. The second reason is really this is tying together 3 different stories. This is not really giving away anything, but Daniel does go back to Italy. Ari goes up north to try to solve the case. But in many ways already people are responding most to this. The third thing is that Ari's granddaughter who has only recently discovered that she's his daughter and that she's at least half Jewish, has this extraordinary relationship with her grandfather. And one of the things that I found all the years of talking to survivors and survivors' kids and grandchildren is it's overly simplistic, but usually there are survivors who will not say a word about it, or there are survivors who really are keen to talk about what happened. But about a year ago, a friend of mine said, you know, my father wrote a whole book and he gave it to only one of my siblings with clear instructions. I'm not allowed to see it. Only my children, only his grandchildren could see it. So Ari's father sits down with his granddaughter to tell his story. And I found that just so compelling. And as he's telling his story, she's starting to realize that the Holocaust wasn't just something that she read about or that she, that was like an interesting or compelling thing in history, but that it really had an effect on her. And, to go back to your first question, I grew up in an upper middle class family in Toronto. My father was a successful radiologist. My family, the Rotenbergs, been here since the 1800s. And although, of course, the Holocaust meant so much to me as any young Jewish person, I remember we would go to my grandpa Zeidel's and my grandmother's place. They were my family from the other side. And I knew my grandmother had come from Poland. And there were these two massive pictures on the wall, these very stout, stern-looking people with my aunt, and it turned out that my grandmother, Anne, who had left Poland when she was 19 and only went back once to see her parents. And that was a picture in the 1930s. And, right now we talk about the Holocaust all the time, but Robert, I'm not sure if you remember, but when we were growing up, it wasn't really so top of mind with people. I see someone shaking their heads. And I remember, I guess I must have been about 14 or 15 and saying one day to my mother, like, who are those people? They were like, oh, your great grandparents. And then saying, what happened? And I remember my mother, who was a very straightforward person, kind of saying, well, they're gone. And when I think now, I think how naive, but it's only later that I thought, of course, they were gone. They were building the Holocaust. So the Holocaust, that seemed something that happened to other people. Then I kind of realized, wait, my mother never had grandparents. My grandmother never really had parents. So as William Faulkner said, the past is not past. And that's one of the things that I really find fascinating about writing about history with current characters, because it brings it forward. So that's a very long answer to a short question.
All good. Speaking of questions, we do have some questions already from our audience. I'm going to take one right now. Interesting, right. This one. There's no name attached to it, so I can't attribute it to someone in particular. But the question is, do you ever encounter anti-Semitism or Holocaust denial?
With everything that's happened since October 7th, I've been saying to people, to my kids, my friends, Robert, you and I grew up in probably the best time to be Jewish in the last 2,000 years. Growing up in Toronto, there were some slights and some stupid things that were said, but really it wasn't a huge factor in my life. I don't know what's going to happen with this book. I'm quite, not only I do not shy away from being Jewish, I'm extraordinarily proud of being Jewish. I remember when the book first came out, so I asked the publisher, like, well, should I use my name? I didn't know anything about writing. So I used a pen name. He said, well, why would you bother? And this was the publisher who's not Jewish. I said, of course not. And in fact, they display my name, which is obviously a very Jewish name. But what's going to happen going forward in the world we live in now? I don't know, but I'm ready for it. I'm certainly not going to back down. Absolutely not going to back down.
But it doesn't sound like in reference to this question, in terms of your work, in terms of the writing, doesn't sound like you've encountered much anti-Semitism or Holocaust denial, to answer that question.
No, I have not yet.
Okay, good. also in reference, Bobby, to something you said, not only did you mention it was the hardest book, this most recent one, for you to write, it was also the most rewarding.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, the first book I wrote, Old City Hall, I didn't really know. It took 10 years to write because I learned how to write. And it's really, you know, I'm a criminal lawyer. I've been a criminal lawyer for more than 30 years. It's mostly a courtroom drama. And it was really fun writing about courtrooms. And then as the books progressed, I wanted them to be more than just a whodunit. So I wrote a book called Stray Bullets, which is about the gunplay that's erupted in Toronto. My last book, Downfall, is about the homeless situation in Toronto. So every book I was writing was based on really current events, current issues in the city. And I found that more exciting than just some mystery and who did it. But this book feels to me at a completely different level. It's not, there's no courtroom scenes. I've kind of gotten way far away from that. There are some courtroom-ish kind of small scenes, but it's just writing about more serious and more important things. You know, Robert, I had no idea when this book came out. I thought people might say, well, wait, I thought you wrote murder mysteries. Why are you getting into all these serious topics? And so far, the response has been the exact opposite. People saying, well, I'm really excited to read something that's really meaningful and really challenging and raises some really, really difficult moral questions. And to me, that's what I want to do. I mean, whether it sells or not, we'll have to find out. But that's why it's the most rewarding, because I feel like I'm really talking about things that matter to me. And I really had to dig into myself to write this book. You know, it's a funny thing. Sometimes when you're writing, on a good day, you write something that's very funny, and you find yourself alone where you are 99% of the time laughing. But every once in a while, you write something and you find you've brought yourself to tears, and you think, well, maybe I fit the right note.
Now, I know you did a lot of research into World War II in preparing this book. What was the most surprising thing you learned in the course of all that research about World War II?
That's a great question. I think one of the most surprising things was Canada's participation with the prisoners of war. What happened was there were, I'm going to get the number wrong, I think there were something like 200,000, 300,000 German prisoners of war in England. And when, in the darkest days of the war, when it looked as if the Germans were going to invade England, the Allies didn't want to have a fifth column of all these German prisoners there. So they shipped them out to the United States and to Canada mostly. I knew that.
Bobby, I have to interrupt. Don't say the number because it's a question that's in.
Okay, I won't. Okay.
That's one of our questions to win a book. So I have to preempt you there. Excuse me for
many, more than one. Okay.
We're going to get to that question very shortly.
But I didn't realize how extensive it was. And for example, I did a lot of research about Alberta. There were 3 different camps. And in fact, people are already writing these things. I never knew about that. And what's fascinating was of the 3 camps, one of them were hardcore Nazis. So they actually isolated them from the other 2 sets. This is a fascinating fact. They kept them there until 1948 because Canada needed people to work on the farms and things like that. And then they were all sent home, back to Germany. And in 1951, I believe, they were allowed to come back, and 10% of them came back. Now, that's part of the book where most of them probably were normal people, but not all of them.
Let's turn now to questions number 2 and 3 to win a copy of What We Bury. So, and remember, as some of you have done already, please use the chat box to be eligible if you have the correct answer. So here's question number 2. This is one of the lighter questions. In Bobby's books, his main character, we already said, is Ari Green. He's the only child of Yitzhak Green, a Holocaust survivor. But significantly, where does Ari always go to buy fresh bagels in Toronto for his father?
I can't wait to see these answers.
Okay, so I'll pause a few seconds. There are many options in Toronto where you can buy fresh bagels, of course.
There we go.
Some are more venerable than others. Okay, you have a few seconds to answer that question. Now I'm going to turn to question number 3. And this is the one which I had to interrupt Bobby on. But before I actually pose the question, I'm going to give you a related obscure Canadian footnote to the Holocaust. Most Canadians alive today, I think it's safe to say, wouldn't know that during World War II, 2,300, I'll repeat that, 2,300 German, Austrian, and Italian Jewish boys and men were sent from Europe to Canada, where they were classified as, quote, enemy aliens.
Right.
And more shockingly, they were kept in internment camps for several years in different provinces. But the question is, number 3, in Bobby's book, the most recent one, he does spotlight the story of Nazi German soldiers who, after being captured as prisoners of war, were shipped to Canada during World War II. How many in total were actually interned in Canada?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good to see those answers flowing in. Very wide range of answers I see in terms of numbers.
You're not allowed to Google this, by the way.
All right, let's continue on, Bobby, with the next question. Apart from, and I'm sure for each of your books, you obviously want to give people a very engaging, sometimes even entertaining story. But what would you hope that people take away from this latest book?
Well, a few things. First of all, I like to say I kind of joke. I say I like to write airplane reading for smart people, and I like to say, did you laugh? Did you cry? Did the pages turn? And mostly, did you laugh? Because I always put a kind of comic spin on, and especially in this book, in one of the characters. But I got a beautiful letter today from a reader just saying that the book really made him think very, very deeply about really complex questions and wondering what he would have done in the situations people find themselves in. I don't want the books to be didactic. They're not lectures. I think a writer's job is to ask questions, not to give answers, but to really form those questions through the characters. And so I think what I want most of all is for people to be moved by the book, to really, I mean, it's great because people keep writing me. I kept them up all night. They read it in a day. They couldn't put it down. That's all very nice, but that's why I don't want to just write a simple Agatha Christie whodunit. I want people to come away more thoughtful. I mean, it's wonderful when people say, I didn't know all these things, but I really want to raise complex and difficult moral questions and really make people think things through. That's what I really want people to come away with. And of course, I want them to say, when's the next one coming up?
Can I just see a show of hands among our appreciated audience there? Can you just hold thumbs up if you've read any of Bobby's books? Okay, but there are some people obviously who've not yet had the pleasure of discovering Bobby's writing. Okay, I just was curious to get a sense of that. And maybe after this discussion, those of you who have not yet had a chance to read a book will be motivated to do that. Speaking about writing books, I imagine, knowing you, Bobby, you're already in the throes of preparing your next book. And I know authors are sometimes superstitious about discussing their works in progress. I know some feel it may jinx the book, but well, let's put it this way. What should readers look forward to in your next book?
Well, it's almost done. It's going to be out next year at this time. People are always shocked, but it takes a long time to get a book in progress. And my goal now is to continue writing a book a year. I think in the next book, I know people are very anxious to know what's going to happen at the end of this one, but it looks like the next book you're going to learn about I'll tell you, don't tell anyone, okay? It's set in 1988 when young Ari Green is sent on a complicated mission. That's all I'm going to say. So it's a prequel. And you know, Robert, what's great about that is I've created this character. Now I get to kind of create, I have in my mind a lot of what his early story is, but now I get to create a lot more of that. For example, everyone knows who's read the books that his father ran was a cobbler. It's something that he'd learned in the camps, and he ran a shoe store, which candidly is based on one of my good friends who I grew up with. And we know in the books that his mother had died from Alzheimer's and had this terrible last few years when every time someone came in the door, she thought they were Nazis coming in. Now, there's an example of something that I picked up from a friend of mine who that happened to his mother. And I'll never forget, Robert, him saying, like, why all my mother had lived through to survive, did she have to be tortured like that at the end of her life? So the reader doesn't really know anything about his mother. So now I get to create that whole other relationship. So I don't know, I got a lot more books in me, so luckily.
Right on. I'm
Yeah.
going to take the next question from a member of our audience who has written, is there ever going to be an Ari Green TV series?
Well, funny you should ask. We came extraordinarily close to getting a series years ago. And although, of course, I wanted it back then I only had 2 or 3 books. Now that I have 7 and all these other ideas, let's put it this way. There is a lot of interest from a lot of people. In fact, the last few days. But, you know, Hollywood, it's like, oh, well, let's see when it's produced or not. But I tell you what, if any of you know the president of Netflix or CBC or NBC, just give them a call, tell them to read the books, okay? The exciting thing is that people who are interested are actually reading the books, so that's good.
And I encourage other people in the audience, please do submit your questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can.
Robert, we might have a part for you in the TV series.
You'll have to speak to my agent first.
Okay.
We're going to turn now to questions 4 and 5 to be able to win a copy of What We Buried. Question number 4. In What We Buried, one of the characters comes from an Italian port city that was the scene of a famous World War II battle in December 1943. In that battle, the Canadians ultimately won against German troops, but they paid a heavy cost. What's the name of that city?
Now, Robert, you asked me what surprised me about this book. I see we got one right answer already, but I'm kind of an amateur historian, I'm fascinated by history. But speaking of this battle, which is very well known by, in fact, Farley Mowat, the Canadian writer, was there. I'm quite surprised how many people either haven't heard of it or don't know. On the contrary, the last few weeks I've had the privilege of doing a lot of book events, and at every single event, someone has come up to me afterwards and said, my father, my uncle, my whatever, was at blank during the war. And of course, they're very anxious to talk about it. And again, either they knew all about it or they said, my father would never talk about it. Same kind of dynamic. I see Padina is shaking her head. I'm not really able to see many people, but
All right, let's take another question.
okay.
Which says, I haven't read any of this author's books yet. Do I need to read the previous books before reading this new one?
Well, I have a very simple answer for that, which is no, because this book is, each book really works as a standalone, but ideally, I would suggest people start with this book. It tells you some of the backstory, for example, about Kennicott's parents and brother. But if you read this book, then you can go back and start with Old City Hall and read all 6. It is better to read the series altogether because, well, certain things happen to certain characters, which I don't want to ruin them for. By the way, Simon Schuster is now talking about doing a box set of all 7 books, which would be really, really lovely if they do that.
The question that I had prepared for number 5, you actually inadvertently gave the answer.
Uh-oh.
Which is okay. So I'm going to improvise for question 5. But what I had originally prepared was Ari's father, the Holocaust survivor, Yitzhak. Like many survivors of the camps, not that there were many survivors, but those who were fortunate to survive the incarceration in these death camps often attributed their survival to they had some profession or some trade that they parlayed into being kept alive. And in the case of Ari Green's father, well, if you were listening, you'll know the answer. So that's why I'm going to give you and he continued when he came to Canada, what was his trade?
Oh.
So I just posed the question knowing that many of you know the answer because Bobby unknowingly gave it away. But here's another question, but this one is more directed at those of you who've read some of Bobby's recent books. So Ari Green is at a certain point reconnected with his long-lost daughter. And what eventually is her profession?
Good question.
Okay, but that's a little bit unfair to those of you who haven't read the book, but okay, we'll keep that a little more exclusive. Another question, Bobby, now for you, and I know a lot of these questions relate to the Holocaust now, but given what Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, given a lot of our work in Holocaust education and our interest in that subject, so maybe it's a little bit skewed because obviously your books are not primarily about the Holocaust, but the Holocaust does figure, if not always prominently, to some degree in the books. At one point, you have Ari Green's father recounting his experience in the small village when the Nazis arrived.
Right.
Is that based on a true story?
It's not only a true story, it's the story of the town of Ivansk, which is where my great-grandparents came from and where I returned to with a group of people about 12, 13 years ago to rededicate the cemetery. It was an extraordinary trip and I could talk about it for 3 hours, but that was the story of the town. And so there's an example of using absolutely true history. And without giving it away, what he recounts in the book about what happened and the night when the Germans came, they went literally from town to town to town, day after day. So the night before, the people there knew what was going to happen. And you have to remember, this was a town of 4,000 people, 2,000. And I hate it when people say 2,000 were Poles, 2,000 were Jews. There's one of the people on our trip who happened to have been born there said, well, we were all Poles. So 2,000 of them were Jewish, 2,000 of them were Christian. They lived together in harmony for 500 years. So it was a tragedy for everyone, even for many of the people who saw their best friends literally killed in the streets by the Nazis. I mean, I could talk about it for hours, but yes, it was based on absolutely a true story. And again, there's an example. If I hadn't have actually been there and talked to people and researched it so much, I don't think it would have come across as real. It would have come across as just a kind of 101 story, but it's not, it's real. And I suspect of all the people here, some of them have, here's a question. Do any of you have ancestors from Ivansk? Let's see if we had anyone who says yes. It was, just so you know, there were 2 cemeteries in Ivansk. Eventually, we were able to find one of them and reconstitute it. The other one was never found.
All right, next question, Bobby, and this was one perhaps, interestingly enough, you may be able to integrate it into your next book because it's about your chief protagonist, Ari Green. And Peggy has asked, how would Ari Green respond to current anti-Semitic demonstrations? And as I say, maybe your answer can figure into your next book.
Well, you know, it's interesting because in my law office here, there's police officer Mark Mendelson, who's very well known. He's on the radio all the time. And it's a cute little story. I knew about Mark, but I never wanted to meet him until the book came out. And actually, we had a big case that he was going to be involved in. So I said to my partner, you meet him. I don't want to see him or meet him until I finished my book. But he was the only Jewish homicide detective. Now he's my friend, and we talk a lot. He was actually at my last book launch. So he was very involved in the Zundel trial. And when you talk to him about it, he knew how to straddle the line between what the police have to do and also what had to be done. I don't know, maybe he'll have to deal with that dilemma in the next book or two.
Here's a comment, not a question, from Jane, who says, I hope your book inspires more people to write down any family stories about the Holocaust so they are not lost. Interesting.
Well, to brag a bit, though, if you look up the Winnipeg Free Press, I think we've got it up on the website, or else we'll put up. There was a lovely review, and actually it was really interesting. I'd never seen this before. You could actually listen to it as well. But the very last line was, well, maybe you should talk to your grandparents. Because thank you for that comment, because a lot of what I'm writing about is well, don't let that history die. One of the characters in the book is based on a 98-year-old Morse code spy from England. Her name is Kathleen Lavin, and you'll see she was literally a Morse code expert during World War II. And I had the privilege of going to see him with Davin. We have this terrific video of her actually reading Morse code of the book, and she was at the book launch. She's 98 years old, and as she said, it's all come back to her. But what was fascinating about that, briefly, Robert, was her family didn't know very much about this. Because of the Secrets Act, she never really told them. They knew that their father had been a World War II hero as a pilot. So by getting her to talk about it, it also brought the family to like, oh my God, we have this extraordinary history in our family. So if this book can provoke people to get their grandparents, great uncles and aunts to talk, isn't that a wonderful thing?
Absolutely. I'm going to take a question here from Arnold in Israel. I don't know, it must be about 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock. Who's definitely stayed up late to watch this, so we're very appreciative, Arnold. The question is, do modern books yet have any impact on a general social perception of the Holocaust? We're putting you on the spot, Bobby. I don't know if you're the definitive expert on that, but do you have any perspective?
I think we're at the stage in what historians call historiography, where it's almost like the secondary or the tertiary story. So at first, if you think about 20 years ago, people all these stories about D-Day and about Schindler's List and about, so that was kind of the main story. But now if you look at the story that the books that are selling now, they're more about like almost the day-to-day, more the individual stories. So I think fiction is the way that people tell stories. I mean, I really think fiction is ultimately the most powerful thing. If you wanted to learn about what it was like in England in the Industrial Revolution, you'd read Dickens. If you wanted to read what it was like in California during the Dust Bowl, you'd read Steinbeck. So I think the books that are coming out now about the individuals, there's a very popular book now about some French resistance fighters. So people want to know what it was like for the individuals and how they survived and what extraordinary heroic acts a lot of them did.
I'm going to take one last question, and then I'm going to read the answers to the 5 questions.
Yeah.
So people can know if they submitted a correct answer or not. But the last question here is, would you say most of your research is firsthand conversations with individuals, or secondhand through texts, etc.?
Oh, the best research is talking to people, talking to, for example, there's a friend of mine, Ron Davis, his mother. I asked her one day, how did you meet your husband? And she said, well, it was simple. I was in a DP camp and he walked in the room and he was good looking. I said, you're good looking. Why don't we get married? And we got married a week later. So there's an example of being one generation away from this, because I said to Ron, are you kidding? And he looked at me like I was crazy. He said, well, of course, that was all the survivors' marriages. And in fact, in the DP camps, that had the highest marriage rate, birth rate in the world. And as she said to me, well, why not? I had nobody. Everyone is gone. My parents, my brothers, my sisters, my aunts, my uncles. So, that's to me, being an novelist is like being a spy. You're just kind of soaking in little bits that you get from people. So that's the best research. A lot of the historic research I did was a lot of fun. It was a lot of work. And of course, you only take little bits out of it. But I don't want to write a historic text. I want to write a story. The story is what carries and what moves people. Hey, can I ask a quick favor? That I want to do something quickly. In the book, at one point, Allison, the granddaughter, her father says, well, I can do this. So I don't know if you can see me doing this with my fingers. And I remember when I was in Poland, seeing these gravestones. So I'm just curious. I mean, this is something that like Dr. Spock could do on Star Trek, because he was Jewish. And cute little thing is that he used to have to tie up with invisible tape the actors who couldn't do it, right? So I'm curious if we could see a show of hands, how many people can do this? How's that? Not everyone can, but many people can. No, you see? It's very interesting, huh?
So Bobby, I know that I said that was the last question, but wouldn't you know that my beloved son, Itai, who lives in the States, has just sent you a question, and who he has a great affinity for you. His question is,
great. Hi, Itai. Yeah.
How did you choose the title and cover design for your latest book, and what significance do they hold for you, both the title and the cover design?
Okay. True confessions. The title, I spent 3 years writing this book and 3 years struggling with the title. And I wanted to get something about Italy or Roman or something. I came up with maybe 40 or 50 terrible titles. And one day, one of the editors just said, well, what about this title? And immediately it just worked on so many different levels, whether it's the massacre or memories or whatever. But the cover is, usually with the cover, you see 3 or 4 different versions and then you play with them and stuff. This cover immediately I knew it was right. And in fact, it's interesting when I go to bookstores, people say, oh, that's a bestseller cover. The point is, and this is a bit of marketing, I'm not embarrassed about, this book isn't just a murder mystery. It's not a courtroom drama. We wanted to project to readers that this book was about more serious, more complex issues. So Itai, I didn't come up with the title. It was the only time I didn't come up with the title. But I'm thrilled with the title, and I think almost more thrilled with the cover. Because it's something, it's that sense of there's something being hidden, something unknown. Doors are very powerful things, like staircases. So that's the answer. Thanks, Itai.
But should we judge the book by its cover?
Well, I think it's a great cover, so.
All right, before we run out of time, I promised I would read the questions and more importantly, the answers, so you'll know whether your answers were correct. So you may recall the first question was, while researching his book, Bobby learned that of all the countries in Western Europe in World War II, in which one did the Nazis deport the highest percentage of its Jewish population to concentration camps? And several of you did get it correctly. The answer is, in the Netherlands, the Nazis deported 75% of the country's Jewish population, the highest such percentage in Western Europe during the Holocaust. Interestingly enough, they've just opened a Holocaust museum in Amsterdam a couple of weeks ago. The first real Holocaust museum in Holland of the kind. Number two, in Bobby's books, his main character, Ari Green, is the only child of Yitzhak Green, a Holocaust survivor. Where does Ari always go to buy fresh bagels in Toronto for his father? And several of you did get this correct. The answer is Greif's. Question number three. In his most recent book, Bobby spotlights the story of Nazi German soldiers who, after being captured as prisoners of war, were shipped over to Canada during World War II. How many were actually interned in Canada? Moment of suspense. A total of 34,000, whose internment conditions, interestingly enough, sadly, were said to be better than what the 2,300 Jewish so-called enemy aliens faced in their internment camps in Canada. So I repeat, the German prisoners of war had better conditions than the 2,300 Jewish boys and men who were confined to their internment camps. Question number four. In What We Buried, one of the characters comes from an Italian port city that was the scene of a famous World War II battle in December 1943 that Canadian soldiers ultimately won against German troops, but at a heavy cost. What is the name of the city? The answer is Ortona, which is on the Adriatic Sea and was the scene of 8 days of fierce fighting between Canadian and German troops that claimed the lives of 500 Canadian soldiers as the price for prevailing over German forces. Number five, well, there's two, actually, because I included the one that was originally planned, even though the answer was given earlier. But as with many Holocaust survivors, Ari's father survived the concentration camps by having a trade. When he came to Canada after the war, he continued doing the same work to support his family. What was his trade? He was a cobbler. The other improvised question was, what was the profession of Ari's daughter that he was eventually reunited with? And the answer is journalist. So congratulations to all of you who answered correctly, specifically those who were the first to answer correctly the five questions. Next week, Simon & Schuster will be sending out the books. What we'll do is we'll obviously have to get your address for the ones who are the winners. So we'll be in touch. Probably Elise will reach out to you. So be ready for that. There is a fast question, Bobby. I know you'll like this one. Is the book available at Indigo?
It's
That's a
available.
that's a short answer, right?
It's available everywhere. And I'm going to 2-second promo. Go to my website, Robert.
Shameless plug. Shameless plug. Come on.
Shameless plug, yes. Robert, let me tell you about my book. RobertRotenberg.com, and sign up for my website, or you can buy it right from there. And if you're near an independent bookstore, I really like to support the independents. Thank you so much.
Speaking of thank yous, and I try to be mindful of time, we wanted to try to stick to an hour. So I first want to thank you, Bobby, for taking the time to being with us this evening and helping us inaugurate our new book talk series, which we are planning to hold every few months. It's a quarterly series. So we hope everybody on this call will return for the next installment, which we'll obviously be in contact with you about. I also want to thank all of you who took time from your evening to join us. I hope you found this interesting. Please, and I really mean this, we welcome all feedback, constructive criticism, suggestions for future authors and books. So please do let us know how we can make this even more engaging for you, and for us too also. And tomorrow we'll be sending an email out which will have a link to the recording, because some of you I noticed couldn't join from the beginning, so you missed parts. You may want to see the recording to see what you missed. There were a number of people who told us they unfortunately couldn't be with us live this evening, but they did want to watch a recording. So this will be of value to them, and we'll be sending out a link tomorrow, so you'll have be able to have the recording. And with that, I just want to thank everybody again, and hope you have a great evening. And thanks again, Bobby, for being with us.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it very much.